You know what catches most men completely off guard? It's not the moment they finally speak their truth or lay down boundaries or deliver that perfect comeback they rehearsed in their head. It's when they finally shut down. When the explanations stop. When the defending ends. When the pursuing just cuts off. Pure silence. Complete withdrawal. And here's what nobody warns you about: the real shock isn't what that silence does to you during those quiet hours and days. The actual surprise is what it does to her. Because the entire game board flips the second you stop playing your usual position. Not because you said something profound or made some calculated power move, but specifically because you quit responding in the pattern she'd learned to predict. Think about the mechanics of every connection you've ever had. They all run on patterns, like clockwork. She figures out your timing. She discovers which buttons trigger which responses. Pull away slightly and you lean forward twice as hard. Go quiet for 12 hours and you send 3 texts checking in. Act cold and distant and you warm up trying to fix whatever broke. These aren't necessarily conscious manipulations on her part, just behavioral patterns she's observed and filed away. Patterns create comfort. And that comfort manufactures a sense of control. Not the dark, twisted, manipulative control you see in toxic relationships. Just basic human psychology. When she can accurately forecast your next 3 moves, the whole dynamic feels manageable because it operates inside known parameters. Safe territory. Mapped landscape. Predictable outcomes. But the exact instant you stop following that script, predictability dies. And the moment predictability vanishes, her sense of control evaporates with it. Because now your silence transforms into a puzzle she can't immediately solve. She can't determine if you're intentionally creating distance, if you're genuinely unbothered by the space between you, if interest died completely, or if you're operating from an entirely new framework she hasn't encountered before. That uncertainty, that unreadable quality, it manufactures tension that words could never create. Not because silence holds some mystical power in itself. It works because it shatters the established rhythm she'd been unconsciously dancing to. It breaks the predictable call and response pattern. The familiar back and forth disappears. And when established patterns shatter unexpectedly, the human brain immediately shifts into problem-solving mode, trying to reconstruct what changed and why. Here's the part that rewrites everything. Instead of you sitting there analyzing her mixed signals and confusing behavior, she starts analyzing yours. That role reversal is what 90% of men completely miss while it's happening. The attention that was laser-focused on decoding her hot and cold signals suddenly redirects entirely toward understanding your new operating system. Simply because you stopped feeding data into the old program. And this shift in attention, this is where something starts stirring beneath the surface. Not always visible from the outside. Not always expressed emotionally. But registering deep in her awareness as fundamentally different from before. When someone grows accustomed to a specific response pattern and that pattern suddenly vanishes into thin air, it creates a vacuum. An empty space where certainty used to exist. Because your reactions, even the messy ones, even the ones that sparked arguments and created friction, they were dependable. She could count on them. That dependability manufactured stability. And consistency, even inside broken dynamics, builds a foundation that feels secure. She knew exactly where she stood because she knew precisely how you'd respond to any given situation. That knowledge created her sense of stability. But when that consistency crumbles overnight, the stability collapses right alongside it. Now she's navigating something she didn't have to deal with before. Empty space. Actual room to think without your immediate reaction filling every gap. Room to feel the weight of silence. Room to register the distance between how things functioned yesterday and how they're operating today. An empty space amplifies everything. When you were constantly reacting, jumping in, filling silence, there was zero room for anything else to breathe. Every moment got occupied by your responses, your explanations, your visible effort to keep connection alive. But now nothing's filling that void. And human brains hate empty voids. They don't leave them alone. They fill them with questions, with meaning, with scenarios. When gaps appear, pressure builds inside them. So the panic doesn't come from you transforming into some mysterious enigma overnight. She panics because you stopped being the predictable constant she could rely on. Predictability feels safe to the nervous system. Safety breeds comfort. Comfort allows complacency. At first, her mind rushes to rationalize what's happening. He's probably buried in work right now. Maybe something personal came up he's dealing with. He's likely just taking space for himself. These explanations feel manageable to her. They keep the narrative familiar inside her head. They don't require her to adjust anything. But here's where her comfortable story starts cracking. Your silence doesn't behave like the temporary distance she's seen before. It doesn't arrive packaged with the usual follow-up text. There's no explanation waiting in her messages. No reassurance appearing after a day. No familiar pattern she can grab onto for emotional comfort. And when that expected pattern fails to materialize on schedule, her safe explanations start feeling hollow. Less convincing. Less solid. Because now she's registering the difference with sharper clarity. Not just that you're quiet in this moment. That you're consistently quiet across multiple days. Not just that you didn't react one single time. That you're not reacting the way you always did before. And sustained consistency in fundamentally changed behavior makes denial impossible. One isolated incident gets dismissed as a fluke. A bad day. A random mood. But repeated behavior over time establishes a new baseline. A new normal she can't explain away. This is when the mental shift accelerates. She's not just noticing surface-level changes anymore. She's feeling them land deeper. And that deeper registration is what transforms casual awareness into active focus on what you're doing differently and why the old playbook suddenly stopped working. This marks the point where her attention genuinely pivots in your direction. Previously, she never needed to think about your responses because they were automatic. Guaranteed. Predictable as sunrise. Now she doesn't know what to expect from you. And when the human mind lacks clear answers, it goes searching. It starts digging. It becomes relentless. The search begins subtle at first. She's replaying recent conversations in her head. Scrolling back through text exchanges. Thinking back to your last face-to-face interaction. Trying to pinpoint the exact moment something shifted and what possibly triggered it. Because your silence isn't registering as simple absence anymore. It transformed into a signal. A message she can't fully decode yet, but one she absolutely cannot dismiss or ignore. And that's what creates magnetic pull toward you. Not because silence screams anything specific into the void. Because it forces her brain into interpretation mode. And interpretation breeds overthinking at an industrial scale. Not the obvious visible kind where she's constantly venting to friends about it. The quiet persistent kind that runs constantly in the background. The thoughts that surface during random moments throughout her day and refuse to fully settle. Did I say something that landed wrong? Is he actually losing interest after all this time? Has he started pulling away for real? Did something fundamental change that I completely missed? These questions don't arrive with convenient clean answers attached. Which keeps them spinning. Keeps them active in her mental space. And here's where the emotional dynamics execute a complete reversal. Before this shift, you were the one reacting to her behavior. Trying to decode her mixed signals. Attempting to fix whatever felt broken. Working overtime to maintain the connection from your end. Now that entire role silently transfers over to her side. She becomes the one noticing microscopic changes. Thinking deeper about implications. Trying to understand what shifted in you. And this role reversal is what 99% of men never recognize happening beneath the surface interactions. Because she's not just casually wondering anymore about what you're up to. She's feeling the difference in her body. The absence of your typical reactions doesn't register as neutral white noise. It registers as distinctly, noticeably different from baseline. And that difference manufactures subtle tension that locks her attention on you. But even at this stage, she might not take visible action immediately. Hesitation still holds her back from moving. She doesn't want to assume too much too quickly. Doesn't want to reach out prematurely. Doesn't want to step into uncertain territory without understanding the landscape first. So instead of acting, she observes from a distance. She waits for more data. She processes what limited information she has. And during this processing period, the thoughts don't stop spinning. They multiply. They return in different shapes. At unexpected times throughout her day. In situations she never anticipated. And that constant repetition builds internal pressure inside her. Because this isn't just a fleeting thought she can brush aside anymore. It became something that stays active. Humming constantly in the background of her daily awareness. Taking up mental real estate. And when thoughts take up that much space, action eventually follows. Eventually, the internal processing stops staying locked inside her head. The thoughts she's been cycling through start influencing her actual physical behavior. Not dramatically at first. Not in some obvious desperate way. Just small, almost unconscious adjustments in how she moves. She might check something directly connected to you. Review past conversations looking for clues. Scroll through old message threads. Consider reaching out without actually hitting send yet. And the specific action itself matters less than what it fundamentally represents. Her attention actively moving toward you without you doing a single thing to pull it there. Because your absence carved out space she didn't have access to before. When you were constantly reacting, showing up predictably, filling every moment of silence with words, there was zero reason to question anything. Everything sat transparent in front of her. Everything was available on demand. Everything was mapped and understood. But now that space exists where certainty used to live. And human minds despise unfilled space. They compulsively try filling it with meaning, with stories, with explanations. And the longer that space remains empty and unexplained, the more active her thoughts become circling around it. Not because she's deliberately choosing to overthink the situation. Because there's no clear conclusion her mind can settle on comfortably. She cannot determine if you're still genuinely interested in her. If you've actually pulled away for good. If you've fundamentally changed as a person. Or if you've simply stopped caring altogether about the connection. And that uncertainty keeps her attention circling back repeatedly to the same questions. Because now she's not just occasionally thinking about you during idle moments. She's actively checking for signs of you. Not always directly through messages. Not always in ways that would be obvious to an outside observer. But in subtle ways that reflect genuine curiosity mixed with concern. Watching for any indication of what you're currently doing. How you're moving through your life. Whether something actually changed in you or she's reading into nothing. And that checking behavior represents a form of engagement, even when it's completely silent. Even when it appears like absolutely nothing's happening from the outside. This marks where the emotional component intensifies beyond simple curiosity. Because it's not just about understanding your behavior on an intellectual level anymore. It's about feeling your absence on an emotional level. The contrast between how things used to operate and how they're functioning now becomes more pronounced. More noticeable. Harder to ignore. And that contrast carries serious emotional weight she can't dismiss. Because your reactions weren't just responses to her actions. They were a tangible form of presence in her life. They occupied space in her day. They created movement in the dynamic. They gave her something concrete to respond to. And without that familiar reliable presence filling space, the entire dynamic feels altered at its foundation. Quieter than before. Less controlled. Less certain. Less predictable. And that fundamental lack of certainty keeps her mentally engaged at a level she cannot easily dismiss or rationalize away no matter how hard she tries. At some point the thoughts and the checking and the quiet background curiosity stop feeling manageable without taking some kind of action. It crosses a threshold. It's no longer just occasional awareness surfacing at random moments. It's no longer momentary wondering she can shake off by staying busy. It becomes something that lingers through entire days. Something that surfaces at 3 in the morning when everything's quiet. Something that refuses to settle no matter how many distractions she throws at it. And when something reaches this level of persistent presence in someone's mind, it doesn't just fade away on its own timeline. It demands resolution. It actively looks for an outlet to release through. Because now doing absolutely nothing feels significantly heavier than doing something about it. The uncertainty she's been carrying around, the lack of clarity about where things actually stand, the complete absence of your usual predictable reactions, it all accumulates into pressure. Not the kind of overwhelming pressure that breaks someone instantly. The steady persistent kind that builds gradually and quietly until action becomes the only path forward that makes sense. And this steady accumulation is what slowly moves her from casually thinking about reaching out to seriously considering it as a real option. And this is where the internal decision forms inside her. Not suddenly like flipping a light switch on. Gradually through distinct recognizable stages that build on each other. She moves from maybe I should say something to it probably wouldn't hurt anything to I might as well just do it already. And that specific progression matters enormously because it reveals the action isn't random or emotionally impulsive. It's the direct result of everything that accumulated internally over days and possibly weeks. But even now when she finally decides to break the silence, she doesn't lead with raw emotion. She doesn't open with everything she's been feeling. She doesn't expose the entire internal process she went through. She doesn't reveal the pressure that slowly built up inside her. Because reaching out at this stage isn't about full emotional expression or vulnerability. It's about strategic testing of unknown waters. Testing exactly where you currently stand emotionally. How you'll respond to her approach. Whether the dynamic between you remains the same as before or something fundamentally shifted. That's precisely why when she finally breaks the silence, the message feels surprisingly small. Something casual and low stakes. Something that almost seems unnecessary or randomly timed. Something that could easily be interpreted as meaningless small talk. And this completely confuses most men who were expecting something proportional to all that silence that passed between you. They anticipated some emotional revelation or grand gesture that matched the weight of the distance. But what they fundamentally don't understand is that the message was never designed to show everything she's feeling. It was specifically designed to crack the door open just enough to see what's on the other side. Because she's not returning fully committed and vulnerable. She's stepping in carefully and deliberately. She's testing temperature before deciding how far to walk in. She wants to read your response clearly before revealing where she actually stands in all of this. This is the exact moment where most men completely misread the entire situation unfolding in front of them. They focus entirely on the surface-level message itself instead of understanding the massive weight of what led to it. They treat it like something trivial. Something casual and throwaway. Something that doesn't carry any particular significance or meaning. But in reality that simple low-stakes message carries the entire weight of everything that happened before it arrived. All the absence. All the uncertainty she sat with. All the quiet curiosity that kept building. All the emotional pressure that accumulated over time. And how you respond in this precise moment determines the entire trajectory of everything that follows from here. Because she's not just casually reading your words at face value. She's reading your position. She's measuring your energy. She's calculating whether you've genuinely shifted or whether you're about to snap back like a rubber band into familiar territory. Whether you fall back into the comfortable patterns she memorized. Whether you react exactly the same way you always did before any of this started. Whether you make everything effortlessly easy again immediately. Or whether something in your response feels genuinely and unmistakably different from before. If you respond exactly how you always did before the silence, the dynamic resets instantly and completely. The tension that built dissolves overnight. The uncertainty she was carrying evaporates. The pattern snaps back like nothing ever changed between you. And gradually, without you even tracking it happening, everything drifts back to the exact same place it started from. The same cycle. The same imbalance. The same inevitable outcome. But if you stay genuinely grounded in yourself, if you don't rush to fill every space, don't overinvest immediately, don't collapse back into the behavior she predicted, something entirely new has room to form between you. Not instantly visible. Not dramatically obvious. But enough of a shift to fundamentally change how she experiences being around you. And that difference in how she experiences you determines whether this entire pattern repeats endlessly or finally breaks into something different. Understand this clearly. Her reaching out is not the victory most men treat it as. It's actually the moment of truth arriving. Because everything that built up during that period, your silence, your withdrawal from reaction, the visible shift in how you showed up, all of it created a specific and fragile perception of you in her mind. And the instant you respond, you either reinforce that new perception she developed or you erase it completely in one moment. Most men never realize this critical exchange is happening beneath the surface because relief floods their system the second she comes back. The validation lands hard. The familiar comfort rushes back in. Every instinct screams to open back up completely. To respond quickly and warmly. To match whatever energy she's bringing. To demonstrate you're still exactly the same person in the same position you always occupied. And that instinct feels completely natural and right. But it's precisely what dismantles the tension that made her reach out in the first place and resets everything back to zero. She's watching you now. Not in some obvious calculated way. Not consciously tracking every single move you make with a scorecard. But internally, beneath the surface of normal interaction, she's observing how you respond to her return. How quickly you abandon the new version of yourself and fall back into familiar comfortable patterns. How much you invest immediately without waiting to see what she actually brings. And whether she recognizes it consciously or not, she's trying to answer one fundamental question that's been sitting unanswered inside her. Did anything actually change in him or did I imagine it? And this is precisely where most men fail completely and decisively. They react from pure emotion instead of staying grounded in their new position. They give everything too soon without letting things develop naturally. They attempt rebuilding the entire connection in a single conversation. They overcompensate dramatically for every day of silence that passed between you. And in doing exactly that, they remove the very element that made them feel different and worth returning to. Because the honest truth is she didn't come back because things felt easy and comfortable between you. She came back because something inside her didn't settle. Something felt unresolved and unfinished. Something kept pulling her attention back regardless of how hard she tried redirecting it elsewhere. And if you make absolutely everything easy and available again immediately upon her return, you rob her of the chance to fully process what actually brought her back to you. You hand her comfort before she's earned clarity about what she wants. You restore complete familiarity before understanding has a chance to develop between you. You rebuild everything instantly without allowing growth to happen naturally. But if you hold your position firmly, if you resist the urge to rush, resist over-explaining your silence, resist trying to recreate what existed before, something fundamentally different begins forming in the space between you. She doesn't receive immediate certainty about where she stands. She doesn't get instant unrestricted access to the version of you she grew comfortable taking for granted. And that deliberate withholding keeps her in a space where feelings have to land deeper before anything resolves. Because now she's not just casually interacting with a familiar face. She's encountering a version of you that operates differently than anything she mapped before. One that doesn't follow predictable scripts. One that doesn't react according to her established expectations. One that doesn't lay every card on the table immediately and without reservation. And that difference creates entirely new tension between you. Not the destructive kind that pushes people apart permanently. The magnetic kind that draws someone in further because they can't fully read what's happening. Because now she genuinely cannot predict your next move the way she once could with absolute confidence. The familiar behavioral map she built no longer applies to who you are right now. And that fundamental unpredictability generates engagement that pure familiarity and comfort could never manufacture between two people. This is where the dynamic executes its real shift. Not because you engineered some elaborate strategy to regain power. But because you stopped actively feeding the pattern that kept everything cycling in the same direction repeatedly. At this stage you're no longer focused on decoding her every move. You're focused entirely on who you are while she's making those moves. Because the real transformation happening here isn't about controlling her behavior or engineering specific outcomes. It's about no longer being controlled by her behavior regardless of what form it takes. Whether she texts first or stays silent. Whether she pulls back or leans forward. Whether she shows genuine interest or disappears completely without explanation. Your internal position doesn't shift the way it once did automatically. And that unshakable stability changes absolutely everything about how you operate. You don't react from impulse anymore. You don't respond simply because something landed in your messages. You don't engage just because something feels familiar and comfortable. You don't invest energy just because an opportunity to reconnect appears in front of you. Every response you give comes from genuine alignment with where you actually stand. Not from emotional reaction to what she just did. And that single distinction prevents you from sliding back into patterns you already outgrew. This is where most men discover something they weren't expecting to find. A calm that isn't built on knowing exactly how things will unfold. Built instead on knowing that however things unfold, you won't abandon your own position to accommodate uncertainty. You won't chase what isn't naturally moving toward you. You won't stretch yourself thin trying to cover distance she should be closing herself. You won't invest deeply into something that hasn't demonstrated it can hold that investment. And that calm makes your presence feel different in ways people notice without being able to articulate why. Because now you're not working to rebuild what existed before. You're watching clearly to see if something genuinely better can form without you forcing it into existence. You're not manufacturing connection through effort and pursuit. You're allowing connection to either develop naturally on its own or remain exactly where it is. And that patience keeps everything authentic instead of constructed. Here's what most men spend years searching for without finding. Not control over someone else's choices and feelings. Actual control over their own responses and position. The ability to stay grounded when dynamics shift around them. The ability to recognize imbalance early and step back before it pulls them under. The ability to trust what consistent behavior shows them over time rather than what hopeful moments promise temporarily. Words change. Emotions fluctuate without warning. Effort spikes briefly then disappears. But patterns reveal everything worth knowing about a situation. And once you learn to read patterns instead of moments, clarity arrives without struggle. You stop getting caught in the same cycles because you see their beginning before reaching their painful end. You stop losing yourself inside dynamics that were never going to give you what you actually needed. You stay exactly where you are and let everything else adjust around that solid foundation. If this shifted something in how you see things, subscribe because what comes next goes even deeper than this.